November 8th, 1944, 11:17 at night. The Scheldt Estuary, Netherlands. The sound was the rhythmic, mechanical thump of a Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun firing at maximum rate. But the tracers were not climbing skyward toward German aircraft. They were cutting horizontally across flooded polders, tearing through the stone walls of a Dutch farmhouse 300 yards distant. Inside that farmhouse, a German machine gun team had been pinning down a platoon of Canadian infantry for 2 hours. Artillery could not reach them. The target was too close to friendly positions. The flooded terrain made flanking impossible. Mortar fire had proven ineffective against walls thick enough to have stood for 3 centuries. Corporal James MacDonald of the Canadian Artillery looked at his Bofors gun, looked at the farmhouse, and made a decision that would have horrified every instructor who had ever trained him. He ordered his crew to depress the barrel to near horizontal, aim at the farmhouse, and fire. The first burst of 10 rounds hit the wall. The 40mm high explosive shells designed to destroy aircraft fuselages punched through centuries-old stone as if it were plaster. The second burst hit the window where the German machine gun was positioned. The third burst hit the same window from a slightly adjusted angle. After 30 seconds of sustained fire, the wall collapsed inward. The machine gun went silent. The Canadian infantry advanced. They found 3 dead German soldiers and a weapon emplaced in a position that should have been impregnable to anything short of a direct artillery strike. MacDonald had just discovered a tactical innovation that would spread through the Canadian Army within weeks, transform a specialized air defense weapon into one of the most feared close support tools on the Western Front, and eventually influence how armies around the world trained their gunners. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what the Bofors was designed to do, and what the tactical situation in the autumn of 1944 was forcing Canadian forces to deal with. The Bofors 40mm was a Swedish design from the 1930s and one of the finest anti-aircraft weapons of its era. It fired a 40mm high explosive shell at 120 rounds per minute. It was accurate, reliable, mechanically simple enough to be operated by well-trained crews under field conditions, and cheap enough to be produced in substantial quantities. By 1944, it was the standard light anti-aircraft gun for Allied forces. Every infantry division carried them. Every naval vessel above frigate size mounted them. Every airfield kept batteries of them. Canadian forces had acquired them through Lend-Lease, through direct purchase before the war closed that option, and through Canadian factories in Montreal producing them under license. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Canadian divisions carried more Bofors guns per formation than most other Allied forces. The problem was that by late 1944, the Luftwaffe had largely ceased to be a factor over Western Europe. German aircraft appeared over Canadian positions infrequently and briefly. The Bofors crews, trained intensively to engage fast-moving aircraft, were sitting idle while infantry struggled and died, trying to overcome German defensive positions that conventional weapons couldn't reach effectively. The tactical landscape of the Scheldt Estuary made this mismatch acute. After breaking out from Normandy, Canadian forces had been assigned the mission of clearing the Scheldt approaches and opening the port of Antwerp to Allied shipping. This meant fighting through terrain that seemed designed specifically to neutralize every tactical advantage attackers could bring. The Netherlands was a landscape of flooded polders, dikes, canals, and fortified medieval villages. Movement was restricted to narrow causeways that German machine guns covered completely. Flanking maneuvers were impossible in many areas because the ground had been deliberately flooded. The thick stone walls of Dutch village buildings resisted rifle grenades, mortar rounds, and anything short of direct artillery fire, which was often unavailable because friendly forces were too close to the targets. Canadian infantry was dying in the mud, held up by German positions that conventional weapons couldn't neutralize. It was in this context that the first Bofors ground fire experiments began. The first documented instance occurred on October 23, 1944, near the village of Woensdrecht. A platoon of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was pinned down by German machine guns firing from a brick factory building. The walls resisted everything the platoon had available. The company commander requested artillery support, but the artillery liaison officer reported that the target was too close to friendly positions to risk it. Lieutenant Robert Chen, commanding a Bofors anti-aircraft section positioned 500 yards behind the front line, heard the situation over the radio net. Chen was a Chinese Canadian from Vancouver who had joined the Army in 1941, trained as an anti-aircraft gunner, and spent months in England waiting for German aircraft that increasingly failed to appear. Now he was in the Netherlands watching infantry die while his gun sat pointed at an empty sky. He studied the factory through his binoculars. The German machine guns were firing from windows on the second floor. The building was 600 yards from his position, point-blank range for a weapon designed to engage aircraft at 3 miles. He called his crew together. "We are going to fire at that building." His gunner, Bombardier William Moss, absorbed this. "Sir, that is a ground target. We are anti-aircraft. I am aware of our designation. There are no aircraft to shoot at. There are Germans in that building killing our infantry. We have a gun and we have ammunition. Depress the barrel as far as the mounting will allow. Aim at the second floor windows. Fire when ready." Moss consulted the manual briefly. "Sir, the Bofors is not authorized for direct fire rolls against ground targets. The elevation mechanisms are designed for—" "The manual was written by people who are not here," Chen said. "We are here. Set up the gun." The crew rolled the Bofors forward to a hull-down position behind a small rise, depressed the barrel to approximately 10 degrees above horizontal, the lowest angle the mounting would permit, loaded a 4-round clip, and aimed at the factory's second floor. At Chen's command, Moss pressed the firing pedal. 4 40-millimeter high-explosive shells crossed 600 yards in under 2 seconds. 2 hit the brick wall surrounding the window. 2 went through the window opening and detonated inside the room where the German machine gun was positioned. The effect was immediate. The explosive force designed to destroy aircraft fuselages was grotesquely excessive against brick and the men sheltering behind it. Chen ordered sustained fire. 20 rounds in approximately 10 seconds, walking the point of aim across the entire second floor. When the firing stopped, the second floor was a ruin. Windows blown out, walls holed, German machine guns silent. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry advanced. They found the remains of 2 machine gun teams and a forward observer. The Bofors fire had not suppressed them. It had obliterated them. The company commander's radio call to Chen was brief. "Whatever you just did, thank you. That is the most effective close support we have had in weeks. Can you do it again?" Chen confirmed that he could. With that exchange, the Bofors had entered Canadian service as a ground support weapon. Word spread through the Canadian artillery with the speed that genuinely useful tactical discoveries always traveled, faster than official channels, through the informal network of officers and NCOs who talked to each other across unit boundaries. Within days, other Bofors crews were experimenting. The results were consistent and positive. Against fortified buildings, the rapid fire and explosive shells reduced walls that rifle grenades and mortars couldn't scratch. Against German positions in tree lines and hedgerows, the Bofors could saturate an area with explosive fire at a rate that no other available weapon could match. Against German vehicles, the 40-millimeter shells penetrated armor that was proof against smaller calibers. The most critical advantage was speed. Conventional artillery required calling fire missions through multiple command layers, establishing communications with fire direction centers, waiting for guns to be assigned and redirected, conducting ranging rounds, and then adjusting onto target. The entire process typically took 20 to 30 minutes from the time infantry requested fire to the time rounds landed. In close terrain against German positions that might be suppressed or abandoned within minutes of being identified, this delay was often fatal to the tactical opportunity. Bofors guns positioned close to the front line and controlled by officers who could see the targets could deliver fire within seconds of a request. For infantry fighting in urban areas or through the flooded approaches of the Scheldt, this responsiveness was the difference between a weapon system that helped and one that arrived after the problem had already cost lives. By early November, Canadian artillery commanders were issuing informal guidance on Bofors ground fire. The official doctrine still designated the weapon as anti-aircraft only. The informal guidance acknowledged that in the absence of air threats, battery commanders could use Bofors guns in ground support roles at their own discretion. This created an interesting bureaucratic situation. Officially, the practice violated doctrine. Unofficially, it was doing exactly what everyone in the chain of command wanted. The solution was to not document it too explicitly. After-action reports mentioned artillery support without specifying weapon type. Ammunition expenditure records listed rounds fired without identifying the targets engaged. This practical fiction allowed the innovation to continue while protecting everyone from formal accusations of regulatory violations. The fiction couldn't last indefinitely. On November 15th, a British liaison officer attached to Canadian forces witnessed a Bofors crew engaging a German pillbox at close range. He was scandalized. His report to British Second Army headquarters stated that Canadian forces were misusing anti-aircraft weapons in ground roles in violation of doctrine and requested that the practice be stopped. The report eventually reached General Harry Crerar, commander of 1st Canadian Army. Crerar was a methodical officer who valued proper procedure. He was also a pragmatic one. He authorized a formal study of Bofors ground fire effectiveness to be conducted by Canadian Artillery Headquarters. Until the study was complete, battery commanders retained discretion to use Bofors guns in ground support roles based on tactical requirements. This effectively legalized the practice while maintaining the appearance that it remained under evaluation. The study ran for 3 weeks, in late November and early December. Artillery officers interviewed infantry commanders, reviewed ammunition and casualty records, and analyzed after-action reports from dozens of engagements where Bofors guns had been used against ground targets. The conclusion was unambiguous. Bofors guns in ground support roles were highly effective, particularly in urban combat, against fortified positions and in situations where friendly and enemy forces were close enough together that conventional artillery couldn't safely be employed. The study recommended formal adoption of Bofors ground fire as a standard Canadian tactic. Crerar approved the recommendation on December 18, 1944. The Canadian Army became the first Allied force to officially authorize the use of anti-aircraft guns in direct fire ground support roles. Official authorization was one thing. Maximizing effectiveness in the field required developing the doctrine, training, and organizational structures to support the technique systematically. Over the winter of 1944 to 1945, Canadian crews and artillery officers worked through the practical challenges. Aiming was the first problem. The Bofors targeting system had been designed for tracking moving aircraft through 3 dimensions, with complex lead angle calculations and elevation adjustments built into the optics. For ground targets, all of this sophistication was not only unnecessary, but actively unhelpful. Canadian crews developed simplified techniques. Beyond 500 yards, aim directly at the target using the anti-aircraft sight while ignoring all the lead calculations. For closer targets, aim over the barrel using visual reference, the way you'd aim a rifle. The high rate of fire made crude aiming viable. Fire a burst, observe where the rounds hit, adjust, fire again. Within 2 or 3 bursts, experienced crews could place rounds through specific windows. Mobility was the second challenge. The Bofors could be towed by truck, but in forward areas, particularly in the close terrain of Dutch towns and villages, getting the gun into position often required moving it without vehicles. Canadian crews developed techniques for manhandling the 2-ton weapon by crew strength alone. 6 men could move it 50 yards over clear ground if necessary, which was enough to position it in locations that would have been inaccessible to anything wheeled. Ammunition supply was the third problem. In anti-aircraft use, an engagement with a single aircraft might consume 20 to 30 rounds. In ground support roles, particularly against fortified positions, a gun might fire 200 rounds or more in a single engagement. Canadian artillery developed forward ammunition dumps and human supply chains. Crews passing 4-round clips hand to hand from the supply point to the gun when vehicles couldn't reach the position. Targeting and coordination was the fourth element. In anti-aircraft use, targets were obvious. In ground support, identifying the right targets and avoiding friendly fire required a dedicated communication structure. Canadian artillery established forward observer teams specifically for Bofors guns. An officer and a radio operator positioned where they could see both the target and the impact of rounds, talking directly to the crew in real time. By January 1945, the improvisation had become doctrine. Training programs were established, manuals were written, tactics were standardized. The weapon that had been designed to shoot down aircraft had become the Canadian infantry's preferred fire support option for close combat. The effectiveness of the new doctrine was demonstrated in Operation Veritable. The February 1945 offensive to clear the Reichswald forest and break through the Siegfried Line into Germany. The operation opened with the largest Allied artillery barrage since the First World War, over 1,000 guns firing for 5 hours before the infantry advanced. When Canadian soldiers moved into the Reichswald, they discovered that German fortifications had survived the bombardment. Concrete bunkers had been built to withstand exactly this kind of preparation. German troops emerged from their shelters to man defensive positions, and the dense forest made conventional artillery observation so difficult that calling accurate supporting fire was nearly impossible. Bofors guns were mobile enough to advance with the infantry through the forest trails. Crews could engage targets at close range without needing the elaborate fire direction infrastructure that conventional artillery required. The rapid fire was ideal for suppressing German positions while infantry maneuvered to close with them. Near the village of Kranenburg on February 10th, a company of the Regina Rifle Regiment was attempting to clear a cluster of concrete bunkers positioned to provide interlocking fire, each position covering the approaches to the others, making it nearly impossible to advance on any of them without being caught in crossfire. The company commander requested Bofors support. 2 guns were brought forward to within 300 yards of the nearest bunker. The forest blocked direct observation, so a forward observer climbed a tree and directed fire by radio. Left 50 yards, down 10. Fire for effect. The crews adjusted and fired sustained bursts. The 40mm shells couldn't penetrate the concrete, but they could destroy the firing slits, shatter the vision blocks, and make it operationally impossible for the German crews inside to function. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the observer reported the positions suppressed. The Regina Rifles advanced and cleared with grenades and flamethrowers. The bunkers were structurally intact. The German crews inside had been battered to the point of offering minimal resistance. This pattern repeated across Operation Veritable. By the end of the offensive, Canadian infantry commanders were requesting Bofors support as their first choice for any target closer than 1,000 yards. The liberation of Dutch cities in April 1945 presented a different problem. German forces retreating toward the German border had established defensive positions in several Dutch urban centers, typically in large stone buildings, churches, town halls, factories, that provided excellent fields of fire. Conventional artillery could destroy these structures, but doing so would cause civilian casualties and erase buildings that had stood for centuries. The Canadians needed to neutralize German positions without leveling entire city blocks. Bofors guns provided the solution. Positioned within a few hundred yards of German-held buildings, crews could aim at specific windows or sections of wall where German weapons were located. The 40mm shells could penetrate walls and detonate inside individual rooms, eliminating fighting positions while leaving the overall structure largely intact. On April 13th, during the liberation of Arnhem, this technique was used to clear German positions from the city's historic church. German machine guns in the tower had command of the main approaches to the city center. Artillery would have required destroying a landmark that had stood for 4 centuries. 2 Bofors guns were positioned in facing buildings. The crews aimed at the tower windows and fired 20 rounds each. The German positions were eliminated. The tower remained standing. Dutch civilians watching the operation were visibly surprised. They had anticipated the kind of area destruction they had seen in other urban battles. Instead, the Canadians were systematically removing German positions with surgical precision. During the Rhine crossings in March and April 1945, Bofors guns took on yet another role. The Rhine was the last major geographical obstacle before Allied forces could drive into the German heartland. German defenders had fortified the eastern bank extensively. Canadian engineers preparing to bridge the river needed suppressive fire that could keep German positions from engaging the vulnerable bridging operations, but conventional artillery was too slow and imprecise for this task, and available armor couldn't cover all the crossing points simultaneously. Canadian artillery positioned more than 60 Bofors guns along the western bank. They fired directly across the river, maintaining continuous suppression against German positions on the far shore while engineers worked. On March 24th, the guns fired over 30,000 rounds in 6 hours, an average of 500 rounds per gun. German defenders later reported that the Bofors fire made it operationally impossible to man their positions effectively. The crossing succeeded with relatively light casualties. Canadian engineers stated afterward that without the Bofors suppression, the bridging casualties would have been substantially higher. By spring 1945, British and American forces were beginning to adopt similar techniques. The Canadians remained the most proficient users of the weapon in ground roles, which reflected both 6 months of accumulated experience and the doctrinal infrastructure they had built to support the technique. There were observable differences in how the three Allied armies approached the method. American forces tended to employ Bofors guns in mass batteries of 4 to 6 weapons, firing coordinated concentrations, maximizing firepower, but requiring more planning time and coordination. Canadian forces typically employed them singly or in pairs, positioned forward and responding directly to infantry requests. This approach was more flexible and responsive, but required well-trained crews and dedicated observers. British forces, characteristically more conservative about departing from established doctrine, used Bofors ground fire primarily in defensive situations rather than as an offensive tool. These differences reflected deeper cultural approaches to warfare. The Americans emphasized mass and firepower. The British emphasized careful planning and doctrinal consistency. The Canadians, fighting with limited resources and consistently assigned the most demanding missions, emphasized flexibility and improvisation, and the institutional willingness to let junior officers violate regulations when the tactical situation clearly demanded it. In the post-war analysis of the innovation, military historians identified several lessons that extended well beyond the specific case. The first concerned weapon versatility. Military doctrine tends to reinforce the designed purpose of every system in the inventory. This creates blind spots around secondary capabilities that weapons actually possess, but that no manual describes. The Bofors was designed for anti-aircraft work, but its rate of fire, explosive ammunition, and mobility made it equally capable as a direct fireground weapon. This should have been derivable from the specifications alone. It took soldiers with an immediate tactical problem and the authority to experiment to actually recognize and act on it. The second lesson concerned decentralized command. The innovation did not come from headquarters. It came from a corporal in the Scheldt and a lieutenant at Woensdrecht, junior leaders who had the authority to experiment and the judgment to recognize what the experiment had demonstrated. If Canadian artillery had rigidly enforced anti-aircraft doctrine and prohibited ground fire until formal authorization was received through proper channels, the innovation would have arrived too late to matter. The culture that allowed junior officers to improvise and protected them when those improvisations worked was as essential to the outcome as the technical characteristics of the gun itself. The third lesson concerned doctrine's relationship with reality. Doctrine provides standardized procedures that allow large organizations to function coherently. It is also necessarily backward-looking, codifying what worked in past situations that may not resemble the present one. When the Luftwaffe effectively disappeared from the skies over Northwest Europe, anti-aircraft doctrine became obsolete for the purpose it had been written. Forces that recognized this and adapted used their resources effectively. Forces that continued to follow doctrine, developed for a threat that had ceased to exist, wasted both the guns and the gunners. The fourth lesson concerned integration. The Bofors ground fire technique worked not because of anything exceptional about the weapon itself, but because of the system built around it. The forward observer teams, the ammunition supply chains, the communications arrangements, the coordination with infantry commanders who understood what the gun could do and how to request it. The weapon was one element in a combined arms approach. Isolated, it was simply an anti-aircraft gun firing at the wrong angle. Integrated into a working system, it was something the German defenders in the Scheldt, the Reichswald, the Dutch cities, and on the Rhine had not prepared to face. The principle that Canadian soldiers demonstrated with the Bofors gun in the autumn and winter of 1944 was not technically complicated. It amounted to this: look at what you have. Ask not what it was designed for, but what it is capable of, and solve the problem in front of you rather than the problem the manual anticipated. That is how Corporal MacDonald looked at a Bofors on a dark November night in the Scheldt and decided that an anti-aircraft gun could solve an infantry problem that 2 hours of conventional effort had failed to address. That is how Lieutenant Chen looked at a factory building and decided that a weapon designed to shoot aircraft at 12,000 feet could eliminate a machine gun team at 600 yards. That is how a tactical improvisation became Canadian doctrine and then influenced how armies around the world trained their gunners in the decades that followed. The Bofors 40mm is obsolete now. Modern armies use radar-guided systems and missiles for air defense. The specific weapon is gone. The principle it demonstrated is not.